So apart from me in London, we have two speakers today, one in Bristol and one in Oxford, and I'll just briefly introduce the two of them. So Dr. Junko Yamashita is Senior Lecturer at the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies at Bristol University, and her work focuses on today's topic, care work and issues of inequality and gender surrounding that. And she's the co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of East Asian Gender Studies, and has also published in Japanese a book which translates as Don't Manage It Alone, Dual Care of Childcare and Elderly Care. And then our second speaker is Dr. Ekaterina Hertog, and she is a research fellow at the Department of Sociology at Oxford University. And she's leading an ESRC-funded project which looks at the scope for new technologies to free up time which is now spent on unpaid domestic labor and measure how willing people are to introduce these technologies into their lives. And she is also a research fellow at the Gen Time Research Project, which looks at gender differences in time use in East Asia. And her research has appeared in a number of academic journals. So this is the timeline. We should get to the Q&A by about 1:45, and we will run on beyond 1, depending on how lively the Q&A session gets, but I'll definitely wrap it up by 1:15. So let me start by passing over to Dr. Junko Yamashita.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I'd like to start my talk. Thank you very much for the Daiwa Foundation for giving me this opportunity and to share my thoughts with all the audience across the world, and with Dr. Ekaterina Hertog, whose research and then thought I'm always interested in learning about. My research interest is to examine how policy and social norms, economic conditions influence people's experience of providing care by comparing between East Asia and the European societies and among East Asian societies. Recently, I have co-led a research project on experience of women who provide multi-generational care, typically both child care and elderly care in Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Care is essential to a national economy and society. It sustains people's lives and relationships, as well as the formal economy. The COVID-19 pandemic created the historical moment when the centrality of care became more visible in society than ever. However, at the same time, recent data shows that care work is reaccumulated on women under the lockdown or stay-at-home order. So my interest is understand the structural factors that keeps assigning care to women, or in other words, not encouraging men to provide care, and how care is valued in society. In this talk today, I try to discuss this through the analysis of women's experience on providing multi-generational care. So today's theme of my talk is twofold. One is what is multi-generational care, and why do multi-generational care continue to accumulate on women in Japan against the expansion of public funded care, against changes in caring patterns, and then against the increase of men's involvement with care. As is defined so in the book that I published with Professor Soma of National Yokohama University in Japan at the end of last year, the multi-generational care is defined as activities and relations involved in simultaneously meeting the physical and emotional requirement of dependent adults and children. The population of multi-generational carers are expected to increase due to long life expectancy, childbirth in later life stage, population aging. For example, the about 5% of women who gave a birth in 1975 was over 35 years old, but the same figure is about 30% in 2019. And multi-generational care is not a new phenomenon. it existed in the past, but a relatively short period of Japanese history. Before then, the life expectancy was much shorter. For instance, the life expectancy for women was 61.5 years old and 58 years old in 1950s. So it was very common to people pass away shortly after becoming ill until mid-1960s. So elderly care became a social issue in the late 70s in Japan. But current forms of multigenerational care differ from that in 1970s and 80s due to changes in social policy frameworks, in family relationship and norms, and in the labor market structure. I will explain more details, especially the first 2 points. So care policy reform. Policy matters. Social policy is one of the institutions that shape and being shaped by caring relations and activities. The expansion of public care is considered as key to redress gendered distribution of paid and unpaid care. I'm aware that there are debates concerning the retrenchment, shrinking of care policies in Japan, inside Japan, but in comparison to other OECD or developed societies, Japan's expansion of public care services are worth mentioning. So the Japan's state responsibility of providing and financing both elderly and child care has been expanded. Japan implemented one of the most generous elderly care scheme among the developed countries and expanded child care service dramatically in last 2 decades. In contrast, the UK, for example, the state responsibility of providing and financing both elderly and child care has been weakened, and UK took austerity measures for both elderly care and child care, particularly in the last decade. So looking at a bit more closely, the child care in Japan, elderly care in Japan, the coverage and finance of these care services provided under the Long-Term Care Insurance Act implemented in 2000 are relatively comprehensive and generous. Child care services and support has also been expanded. Now, since 2019, child care for all 3 to 5 years old and for 0 to 2 years old in low-income households became publicly funded. For care policy in UK, the ongoing shift to emphasize the older persons and their families' responsibility of care provision, especially after 2000, public funded elderly care are very limited to a small group of people. And same trend for child care. The limited financial support is available, but little public funded service for children aged under 2 years old. So looking at the multi-generational care gives us a point to investigate how this Japanese care policy reform compared to UK influenced the care practice and experience in a quite demanding engagement way, quite demanding way of engaging with care. So now we are moving to look at changes in social norms and practice. I would like to highlight 3 changes. The first is change in the caregiving expectations for the elderly care and sustained but shifting gendered care work. And then finally, strengthened motherhood and intensive mothering. From the, the norm of changes in caregiving expectation for elderly care, from the dominance of daughter-in-law to multiple models of elderly care is observed. Norm of traditional filial obligation, emphasizing the role of the eldest son in practice and his wife, who were expected to provide care to aging parents, are weakened. The increasing preference of people, especially female aged over 65 years old, to be cared by professional care worker or their own daughters. The daughter become the dominant informal carer after spouse, followed by some professional care worker and daughter-in-law. A large part of elderly care are provided by qualified care workers now as main carer since the introduction of Long-Term Care Insurance Act in 2000. So the caring pattern has shifted. Norm of gendered care work are sustained but are shifting. the proportion of male informal carer, both spouse and son, has been increasing. 34% of informal carer are male in 2016. The number of male professional care workers has dramatically increased since the Long-Term Care Insurance Act's implementation. Now consists 32.60% of institutional care workers and 23.7% of domiciliary home care workers. Next, about the childcare. So the parallel policy discourse of promotion of women in employment and promotion of motherhood formed in the last decade, part of Abenomics. And the women's employment is seen to play a key role in managing social security expenditure. However, competing with this drive towards women's employment, there is a sustained and even strengthened policy aimed at emphasizing the significant role of the mother in giving birth to and nurturing children. And this emphasis emerged in the context of measures related to, of course, combating the declining birth rate. And related to these policy discourse, the sustained strong gendered norms and division of child care work exist in Japan, conceptualized as intensive mothering or strong maternalism. And even though the increase of female labor market participation has occurred in Japan, the increase of male participation to care work is very slow in comparison to the European counterparts, which I think Ekaterina will talk about. So I have talked through the relative policy reforms, relative care policy reforms, sustained and shifting norms related to care, and now move on to discuss findings based on a research project on multigenerational care. Our research used a mixed method, detailed here. But the point is, the gist is that we managed to generate the original data on multigenerational care and caring that didn't exist before. So we have quite volume of data, not only Japan, but this was a comparative study in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. But I'm focusing about Japan today. This shows that to the question, do you think double responsibility of care is a familiar problem to you? 45.4% said yes. We created this word double care, that it's kind of Japanese English, that indicates that multigenerational care or multiple care, and use that term in our research. This result shows that multigenerational care is becoming a shared issue for the increasing proportion of population in Japan. This is the data from one of the survey that we conducted based on random sampling. If you look at this data, over 30% of people in their 30s are experiencing or will shortly experience double responsibility of care. We thought before doing this research, we thought the percentage could be low. So the much higher percentage of people are experiencing or think they would shortly experience multi-generational care than we initially speculated. So now I'll move on to talk more about the key themes we found from the project. So most of the respondents or the parents use long-term care services at their maximum eligibility. And 62% of multi-generational carers says they were nobody else than me to be the main carer. It implies that majority of multi-generational carers involuntarily became to engage with elderly care. And norms of traditional filial obligation are weakened in daughters-in-law and parents' relationships, but still strongly exist, especially in daughters and parents' relationships. YA said, I was doing it all by myself, then one day I could not stop crying, or I was feeling that my family will be okay even if I disappeared. That kind of unusual thought came to my mind, even though I have small children. So I talked with our care manager. Then she kindly said, care helper should come to help you more often. Since then, the care helper comes in the morning to help with brushing teeth or looking after the stuff around my mother. Or when my mother needs to go to the dialysis, the care taxi comes and takes her to hospital. Then I feel like I'm just looking over her, but not actually taking care of my mother. So you can see that sense of fear in the wanting to taking care of their own parents is very strong. At the same time, that sense of guilt that they are not taking care of their children sufficiently strongly felt among multigenerational carers. So 39.8% of female multigenerational carers in their 30s feels they cannot take care of children sufficiently, which is slightly higher, equally high as those who feel mentally exhausted or physically exhausted. YB says, I have been leaving later than I wanted to take care of my son's mental issues then. I feel difficult being sandwiched, or I want to be with my children more as other mothers do. I wish they can do more extracurriculars their friends do. But with my work and caring my father, I don't have much time for them. I need to send my money for the time I need to drive up to my father's more often in the near future when he needs my support. That's Kate's comment. But when daughters take care of their parents, which is the apparent phenomena, their husband partner often do not get involved in the actual provision of elderly care. Daughters accept non-support from their husband or partner, rather they appreciate their husband's support in the form of not complaining that they take care of their parents or listen to what is happening, referring to the filial obligation in the past, which the daughter-in-law taking care of their husband parents. YF says, my husband is really supportive. He doesn't complain that I take care of my mother. He listens to me when I talk about my parents' stuff. So that's the support they get from the husband. And we also observe that sustained gendered division of care work makes women to be main carer for both child care and elderly care. These multigenerational carers need to simultaneously respond to different types of needs from children and then frail elderly, and constantly make a priority between child care and elderly care. YB says, it's like supporting my father not to fall with my one hand and holding my son not to run away with my other hand. Why she says, I make my child sleep, then my mother wakes up. So I need to calm her down and take her to bed. Then my child wakes up and needs to feed her. So, conclusion. So apparent shifts in family elderly care practices. So more daughters are taking care of their parents. This was observed in our data. Women as daughters do so with scant support though from family, especially husband and partner, under the remaining norms of filial obligation, even though the male engagement of care is increasing. Political discourse of promotion of women in employment and promotion of motherhood are individualizing women's responsibility of multigenerational caring. Mothers consequently seem to internalize the conflict of this drive to female employment, the continuing gendered division of an attitude to childcare, and then feel they have to shoulder the responsibility in providing appropriate care to children in addition to all other responsibilities. Difficulties and tensions experienced by multi-generational carers are not solely derived from the accumulation providing both child care and elderly care, but structurally constructed by policy frameworks, shifting family norms, and sustained gender division of care work. I hope that today's talk, my talk, shows how these structural factors interrelated to reconstructing the conditions under which women voluntarily or without any other choice to provide multi-generational care, often alone. And the expansion of public funded service in both elderly and child care have not had significant impact on gender division of care work in Japan. The expansion of public funded service are well received and indispensable as caring infrastructure in Japan, but that is not sufficient to redress the gender division of care work in Japan. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Yamashita. So let's move straight on to Dr. Hertog, and then we'll do all the Q&A after that.
Thank you very much for this opportunity and for especially to have this conversation against Dr. Yamashita. I really enjoyed the talk. And my name is Ekaterina Hertog. I'm based at the University of Oxford. And it was really interesting to have this quite a nuanced picture of multi-generational households. So my work now is more statistical. But I think it could hopefully would create a good conversation with what we've seen so far. So without further ado, and to make sure we have more time for the Q&A later, I'll now share my screen and hope that technology holds up. Okay, so I hope everyone can see. Let me know if there's any issues. Great. So today I'm going to be talking about a co-authored research project in which I myself and my colleague, Professor Khan from the Department of Sociology at the University of Oxford, looked at the compared multi-generational households with non-multi-generational households in Japan and looked at which implications a multi-generational co-residence has on the daily lives and the daily routines on a rather big sample of couples. So just before we start, although again, Junko, I think, touched upon many of those issues, and many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with these pyramids, the so-called population pyramids from Japan. But just to sort of, as a quick reminder, Japan is aging. It's aging rather rapidly. And in this comparison, we can see that in 1960s, majority of Japanese men and women were young, I think below their 30s or mid-30s. Fast forward to 2020, we don't see a population pyramid anymore. I think some people call it the population kite. So we can see two big chunks of huge groups of people clustered around mid to late 40s, and then the next group is mid to late 70s. So these are, I think, baby boom and the second baby boom generations. And I think these populations are sort of populations we're particularly interested in. We can well imagine that people in the mid to late 70s are the parents of this second baby boom generation who are now in the mid to late 40s, bearing in mind, as I think Junko mentioned already, that the average marriage age in Japan now is about 30 or over 30. Very few people have children before marriage, so but many people have at least one child within marriage. As long as they marry, there's usually going to be at least one child. Those in their 40s are likely to have childcare responsibilities and may already have to start caring for their elderly relatives, and these are big groups of population. So Japan is not very different from other developing societies in that regard, developed societies, sorry, in that regard. I mean, the big difference is Japan ages faster, so it's sort of a really interesting test case. But many of these issues are gonna also be an issue or a problem in other countries, especially East Asian countries. So this is another sort of, I wanted to place Japan in the international comparison. as well. So not only there a lot of elderly people who may be requiring care, and a lot of middle-aged people who are maybe still doing childcare and will start to be assuming elder care responsibilities as well. Japan is fairly unusual in that there's still multi-generational co-residence is still fairly common. This I picked kind of fairly randomly a number of countries from a recent UN report, which, and here the yellow bars are just the sum of a gray and kind of dark orange bar. I think the yellow bar is interesting because it represents what is they called in the report an independent elderly. So these are elderly who either live alone or only with their spouse. They don't have children or other adults in the household. And as we can see, Japan and South Korea are fairly similar in that regard and quite different from the other developed countries, the Western or European developed countries that I picked here, in that independent residence is a lot more unusual there than in other countries. I think even when we compare Japan and South Korea with more traditional, more sort of family-oriented Western countries like Italy here and Spain, still in Italy and Spain, more elderly live on their own than in Japan. So we have a lot of elderly, and these elderly often co-reside with their adult, a lot more often co-reside with their adult children. So we thought it would be interesting to see what does that mean with these newly rising, and as life expectancy continued to rise. I mean, we had a blip obviously with COVID where life expectancy fell across almost all countries in the world. But if we expect a rising life expectancy, as this continues to be the case, this is going to continue to be an issue. Oops, and I did something. Another characteristic of Japan is that it's very there is a very strong gender division of labor. And again, just to give you a taste, not only it's very strong, it's fairly stable. I'm presenting this graph because this is one of the comments I got from the reviewers and from people as I was presenting this work earlier, when people say, well, I mean, you positing Japan as such a conservative society, and yet there's been a normative shift. More people, more men now report that they would like to help more at home, and more men and women both say, this is a sort of big figure often quoted, that they would like women to work. Men do not really want to be married to housewives, neither do women want to be housewives themselves. If we look at the actual time use patterns between 96 and 2016 in Japan, there is a change, but it's been fairly glacial. So men still work a lot more than women, and women still do most of housework. And the disparity in housework participation is a lot larger than the disparity in paid work, participation. So we could see that on average, this is an average number where they averaged weekends and weekdays. That's why you see this, average of 4 hours of work per day, rather than sort of a full time that maybe you'd expect, especially for men. But men, on average, do sort of, half the time that women on average spend half the time that men do on paid work, and men on average spend, I think, it's 20 minutes compared to women's 2 hours 20 minutes, so it's like a sixth. So the disparity is a lot larger when we look at domestic division of labor, and that is likely to transfer to pressures for women in particular. This comes from my own research, looking specifically at married couples. The previous graphs, I think it's an average created by the Statistics Bureau across the populations for both men and women. And we could say, well, some of those trends are also coming from the fact that they're more singles in later years and so on. Well, these are only married couples. And we can see that, again, there is a change. This is wives' share of housework and care work. So in 91, wives in married couples did 93% of all housework and 88% of all care work. By 2016, it's gotten better, but wives still do 87% of all housework and 80% of all the care work. So there is change, but it's quite slow. So what does that mean when in a society where there is a rise of care, especially in an aging society with the rising elder care responsibilities? How are we to think about it? Well, there's a number of theoretical perspectives that could help us make sense of it. First of all, how people spend their time and their daily routines very much depend on their household composition. More people in the household mean that there's just going to be more unpaid work to go around, more cooking, more cleaning, and so on. More people also mean that there could be more potential for economies of scale and more potential for specialization. So one member of a household could take on all the housework and free up the rest for other pursuits like paid work and so on. Existing theoretical perspectives largely think about how this could happen and how to make sense of it in the context of nuclear families. So, for example, you might have heard about specialization theories, which have been touted as particularly relevant for conservative societies like Japan, where a person with more income would be able to outsource their unpaid work obligations to the other member of household, the less earning member of the household, or perhaps would be able to spend their resources in the market, hiring a cleaner or a nanny or eating out, for example, and thus reducing the total domestic workload. Another set of theories says, well, it's not so much about economic resources, it's time availability that's important. It's a person who has more time who's going to take on the domestic work. So the one who works longer is going to do less of unpaid work. The problem, of course, is that the time and the income tend to be closely related, and separating the effects of the two tends to be rather difficult. It also seems these two theories, the resource theories, seem to be somewhat less relevant when we think about multi-generational households, because we are not we don't see two members of a family, two working age husband and wife who are trying to negotiate and maintain their work-life balance and careers. We have a new set of adults involved who potentially are retired and have lower earning power because they're drawing on their pensions and have less potential for new employment, for example. And also they have possibly other needs and care needs. So while we, so the other set of theories that we felt were more relevant in this context and were used in a couple of, or applied, I think, in some previous work, which is rather limited if we focus on multi-generational households, is the gender perspective, which argues that, looks like there's paid and unpaid work participation tend to be highly gendered in many societies, and especially so, less so. Some countries are more gender equal. Japan is one of the very unequal, gender unequal societies. And there, as I showed you earlier, empirically, these roles are really very separated. And at the same time, if we look at multi-generational households, there's also scope for intergenerational solidarity with elderly parents, for example, supporting their middle-aged children as long as they're healthy enough, and helping them with domestic work, freeing them up to participate in the labor market. And when they need care themselves, the children might pay it back. So there is some evidence. I think in Japan there's been research which showed that working age women in co-residing with parents or parents-in-law sometimes are more able to participate in the labor market, but that's quite a dated research. I think by now it's more than a decade old, and the aging trends and the sort of perhaps health status of these elderly has shifted quite a bit in the recent years. So so we wanted to produce a snapshot of what happens in modern Japan and compare, as again Junko highlighted earlier, there's this rising of number of sandwich generations. So in Japan, with women having very high care responsibilities, what we tend to see is that women would do both childcare and adult care. Also, when men and women prior to marriage, upon marriage, domestic responsibilities for women go up very much. For men, they barely change. And then when children appear, we see another raise for women and some raise for men, but it's much smaller than it is for women. So we wanted to see whether there are differences between this sandwich generation and non-sandwich generation. That is, families where there are adult children co-residing with the elderly, but who do not simultaneously have children under 20 living with them in the household. To do this analysis, we use the Japanese time use survey. This is a survey that's collected every 5 years, and the latest one is from 2016. Unfortunately, the latest 2 surveys are only available physically. You have to physically be in Japan. Pre-COVID, when I just started this project, I was planning to go to Japan and work in one of the beautiful on-site facilities and be able to present this research on 2016 data. Unfortunately, life pandemic intervened. So I had to use for this project the latest data that's available to researchers abroad, which comes from 2006. So this is the reason the sample is somewhat dated. At the same time, as I showed you, at least in terms of domestic division of labor, there hasn't been a dramatic change, at least in reality of time use, even though there we might be observing shifting norms in that regard. So I think the findings from 2006 data would still be informative for us, even though it's not the latest survey collected. The advantage of all of these Japanese government surveys, or at least most, is very large samples. So we could really separate quite finely different population groups, for example. And in this case, I have 23,000 married couples, where both members of the couple were aged between 20 and 59. So I wanted to keep them sort of at the core working age population. I looked, my core variables of interest are paid work time, housework and childcare time, and adult care time. So how these were shared within these couples. By my core independent variable of interest was the co-residence and care responsibilities. It's a categorical variable. I'll show you in a minute how it's constructed. What are the 7 categories that I separated the different co-residency types into. And then I control for all the basic demographics I could get hold of. Unfortunately, I do not have individual income in this data. So I had, as a very sort of imperfect proxy, or I mean, as one, I was able to use years spent in education, but as we know, especially for women in Japan, it's not a great predictor of income. But this is the shortcoming of this data, that I was only able to control for household income overall. Okay, so here are the findings. So this is the first, this is paid work time. And we can see here there are 4 groups of people. I ran 4 separate models. The 2 top graphs are women and men separately living in households. They're married women and men living in households with no children under 20. So this is not a sandwich generation. They are, I'm only presenting here the categorical, my core variable of interest, the care responsibilities and co-residency type. As I said, there were 7 groups that I divided people into. Nuclear families, this is my reference category. So this is this little dot. And then I looked how other types of families would differ from these. So the nuclear family, or nuclear couple in this case, no children, no elderly co-resident adults in the household. Then we have households where only co-resident older mother or mother-in-law, depending, I mean, they're lumped together. Co-resident older father or father-in-law. I separated, this would be widowed. I separated mothers and fathers because I wanted to see whether there's any difference by gender. Co-resident full elderly couple, so both elderly parents or parents-in-law live together with a husband or wife, and both are alive. And in this first, the group top group of 4 types of co-residencies, there are no care responsibilities. The working age adults report that they have no adult care responsibilities for themselves. And then at the lower group, we see adults who say they do have care responsibilities. One group is they have a non-co-resident older parent for whom they're caring, so that older parent might either be living nearby, or perhaps the health status means that they've moved to assisted living institution, or perhaps they're in hospital even. And then we have co-resident older parent who requires care. I couldn't split this by gender because the sample was not big enough in the end to like really fine tune, or it would be dominated by either full couples or widowed women. I couldn't separate the men because co-residing, I mean, life expectancy for women is higher. Co-residence with elderly fathers is a lot rarer. And there is a small catch-all other category. There's still care responsibilities reported there, but it's a mix. There could be sort of a widowed mother from one side and a full couple from the other side. That one is difficult to interpret. I kept it, but you will see that it tends to sort of have quite wide confidence intervals and behaves somewhat surprisingly, because it's not always quite clear what's in this category. It's just the other category. So I would focus on the other 6 categories in my interpretation. So and below we have these 2 women with children under 20 in the household and men with children. So these are the sandwich generation, or they're not always sandwich. So the reference group, they have no care responsibilities, but the others, they co-reside with the elderly and don't need to care for them, or sometimes they do have a variety of care responsibilities. So when it comes to paid work time, co-residing healthy elderly or older adults co-residing with their children or children-in-law make a difference for paid work time, especially for women. And it's particularly grandmothers. Wives co-residing with an older fathers, like in this case, there is no change. There doesn't seem to be a change in their paid work time. But anything, when you see the little red line with a dot in the middle, if it doesn't overlap with a dashed line in the middle of the graph, that means there is a significant difference in these arrangements compared to families who don't have care responsibilities and do not co-reside with any elderly, which is the top group where you only see a little dot, the reference category. So living for men, there's barely any difference in any living arrangement. That like they just probably just work, whether they live with people who require care or they don't live with people who require care, they just work. But for men, for women, if they live with elderly relatives who do not require care, generally that really benefits their ability to participate in the labor market. And in that sense, there is little difference between sandwich generation at the bottom and I mean, actually, I don't know if we can even call them a sandwich generation because they live with healthy elderly. So they do not have the care responsibilities yet. They rather benefit from having this additional support of more adults in the family. Once there are care responsibilities, though there doesn't seem to be a big difference for the paid work. I mean, there's this one surprising finding where if they have a non-co-resident older parent, they seem to be able to work less. And I was not sure. Unfortunately, I don't have any more detail about them. I just know that they have care responsibilities outside their household, whether it's their commute time that eats up or they have complicated sort of arrangements going to other households. It would be very interesting, and perhaps a new survey with more detailed insights or some interviews could throw the light on why these are particularly the paid work time of this household, with these wives is particularly negatively affected. For the other, so women with care responsibilities, whether they have children or don't have children, seem not to be very different from women who don't have care responsibilities and live on their own without any domestic support. That might in some way reflect the gender specialization that women what they sort of assume domestic work, and if they don't have any extra help, that kind of interferes with their paid work participation. So these women might be more rested, for example, compared to women who have care responsibilities, but they're not as able to maintain their attachment to the labor market if there's no other adults, and having a presence of a spouse doesn't seem to help very much. So now if we look at housework and childcare, I put them together because in Japan, as probably most of you know, there are very few children born outside marriage. So women with no children under 20 are not going to have any childcare at all. And to make these sort of groups broadly comparable, or I've put these two measures together. So here, as we can see, surprisingly, so co-residing with older father seems to create extra housework responsibilities for women with no children. When with a healthy older father. Otherwise, having healthy co-resident elderly older adults in the household, again, limited difference for men, although we see a little bit when there are care responsibilities. I'll talk about it in a minute. When there are no care responsibilities, men with no children seem to be able to reduce a little bit their domestic load, and they're starting at a pretty low threshold. If you remember, there was like 20 minutes on average or something that they were doing. So now it's probably down to 15 minutes, I'm not sure. For women with no children, the domestic workload doesn't seem to change very much. But when there are children, having a healthy older adult really helps. And I think even older fathers as well make a big difference. I think that probably reflects that you have an adult in the house. Perhaps if you have kids, the mother is able to work until 6 or 7, and the child can come from school, and there's an adult there to receive the child, which is probably more suitable than having no one at all and the child staying there on their own. So having a co-resident elderly reduces to some extent the housework and care responsibilities for women. When the elderly require care themselves, for families where there are no children, women spend especially extra time on housework and care work. So I'll show you elder care in a minute. This measure excludes elder care. So that's just housework and childcare. Where families with no children, that's extra housework, which I think is not something we should be surprised about. It's quite difficult to categorize the differences. Maybe they're cooking extra meals for the elderly. That would be more suitable, and so on. For men, little difference, although maybe a little bit rise here. Again, co-resident older parent, a little bit extra help from the husbands without the children. Interestingly, when there are in families with children, so this is the sandwich generation, there are care responsibilities. There is little, we don't see much of a rise in housework and childcare work. And I think, especially also hearing and being familiar with Junko's work, I also heard this, some of this work. I had insights into it earlier in more of the beginning of her project. This potentially reflects that these women are at capacity, so they just have to cut corners. They're already doing a lot of housework and childcare. When they have care responsibilities, they potentially spend less time doing on childcare, maybe get a bit of an external support with housework. They are not really increasing much if we look purely at time. Okay, this is the last. I'm just wrapping up. So this is the last one. Finally, the adult care. So the adult care, on the one hand, is more clear cut. So if people report care responsibilities, all of them, men and women without children do more work. We observe more care. Women with children also do more care, but men do not. And I think here we really see potentially the gender specialization. So in these families, women had kids, possibly quit their jobs or moved to a part-time employment, and now they're the specializing. If there's more care responsibilities, they're the one who's going to take on the slack. And for men, it makes very little difference. So to conclude, I think what we observed that there are clear patterns of the intergenerational support, but they are very much informed by gender inequalities. So genders, different generations support each other, but it's mostly from in the co-residency with healthy elderly. It's more older women who support the working age generation, and it's working age wife who benefit the most in terms of the ability, for example, to participate in the paid labor market. And it would be interesting to see, to focus similar analysis, perhaps from the perspective of the elderly and what that means for them. So this very much focused on the working age generation. Thank you very much, and sorry to running over.
Great, thank you very much.